All right. Welcome everybody to another Game Design of the Month cast here on the Game Wisdom channel. Each month, myself and game developer Tomo Moriwaki like to sit down and discuss and break down a specific game. And for this month, we are discussing Disco Elysium. But how are you doing today, Tomo?
I'm doing good. Glad to be here. And Disco Elysium is a very interesting game. I mean, it took its launch window by storm and got
Mm-hmm.
those awards and stuff. And I think surprised a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of that surprise, I didn't even really hear much about the game before it came out. Did you?
Um, no, I mean, for me, what was awesome about it is I feel like I know so much about what's going on, both from the inside and as a fan. And
Mm-hmm.
then And then I think I was at a game developer mixer,
Mm-hmm.
a monthly thing in Los Angeles called Game Dev Drink Up, and everyone's talking about the Game Awards and how Disco Elysium won the Indie Game of the Year. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, Disco Elysium? I mean, shoot, that doesn't sound familiar. I feel
Yeah.
like it won Indie Game of the Year, and it doesn't sound familiar. And so I'm sitting there looking it up on my phone and going, "Well, it looks good." I'm like, "Wow, where did this come from?" And then,
Mm-hmm.
when I got a chance to play, I was definitely very impressed.
Yeah. And it came out officially. Let me check everything here. So it came out in 20. I'm sorry, in October of 2019. So little over a year from where we're sitting here recording this right now.
Damn, that was only a year ago. This year has been crazy.
Yeah, of course, definitely. And and again, for that particular time, if you remember, a lot of people were really talking about it. Was like not the was it the Outer Wilds? Is that the one from Obsidian?
Yeah, that's in the same same time frame. I think it did it win some music awards also in that Outer Wilds, I'm
Oh
friends with
wait,
one of the people who did composing on it.
I think it was the Outer Worlds. The Outer Wilds is another game that came out
Oh,
very
Outer
quick.
Wilds, yeah. Outer Wilds is the survival not version of Outer Worlds.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and in terms of just some weird serendipity, there, Outer Worlds came out October 23rd, so that would have been 8 days after Disco Elysium. And I think it's like the only time that I can think of that the indie developer kind of undercutted like the larger developer in terms of like that big game of that month, because that was one that a lot of people were talking about previously.
That's true. And I mean, and that game is really good, right? It's that because it had a really strong several months, and so it's not like it got eclipsed from a pure quality standpoint. It just there was such a sharp explosion of interest in Disco Elysium in that first month or in those first couple weeks even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we were talking about this before the stream in terms of just like what sets Disco Elysium apart. Because if you, for those of you who are fans, like we've spoken about this game on several of our Sunday shows, and it's very much just a choose your own adventure game. We're talking about from like a pure gameplay loop standpoint, but it's kind of like the whole package is something I don't think we've ever really seen before, at least taken to that level.
Well, what I find interesting about it is that it's a really courageous adaptation of the conventions of CRPG rules. Now, I think you could look at it from two maybe totally different perspectives. One is I'd like to take the CRPG kind of fundamentals and I'd like to apply them to everything that it hasn't been applied to yet. And so I'm just doing a weird translation. I need to adapt the game so that my social interactions, my puzzling over analyzing the world around me, and coping with my internal landscape are going to be all the things that I'm going to make CRPGs work with. But the flip side to that is it's like being inspired by CRPG rules to tell your kind of rich procedural narrative experience. And
Mm-hmm.
so between those two kind of vectors of description, I think you find like both the kind of origin and aspiration of Disco Elysium.
Mm-hmm. And like about its story again, about like that kind of like dynamic or procedural storytelling. Like it's one of those games, as we've said this before, on not only on the show but just like in general game wisdom, that you can really tell when a developer kind of goes all in or is like really passionate about the game they're designing. And like Disco Elysium, from a writing standpoint, certainly fits that bill. Like the opening when you're like kind of like in the void and you're having a conversation with like the primordial essence of the universe. It's just such like a weird way of starting a title.
Well, I mean, I think it seems extra, um, kind of like extra unique in its approach, because it's so literary kind of in the
Mm-hmm.
way it treats itself, you know? I think, maybe there's a million books that start off that way. Half of them you describe as pretentious, and the other half you describe as you like them.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I mean, there's video game analogies because I think that literary thought has occurred to many who create games, right? I think you can find the beginning of a number of Ultima games having kind of a similar vibe, right? That you start in the ether and that
Mm-hmm.
there is some kind of essence of the universe you're having a conversation with, or you're crazy and you're waking up from a dream. And I think it just worked really well that their systems reached back into their intro, that it wasn't just a cutscene, right? That it was an expression of the way the game fundamentally works, and that you're not going to get all the information.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And like, and about that information, I think that's a good segment to talk about kind of the character creation or kind of creating your own whatever kind of cop I guess you want to make. And
Yeah.
again, like this is just another one of those spots that just like really stood out to me from a design perspective. That you're given this entire sheet of personality traits, and there's something very very clever that I thought the game did. I want to get your thoughts on this as well. That when you click on each one, it gives you like the description of what that particular trait is, and in that list, it tells you not only what it does, but it tells you what happens if you don't take it. It tells you what happens if you do take too much, and it tells you why you must have this. Even though every personality trait says like the same exact kind of spiel there, and I thought it's just a clever way of just saying, do whatever you want. Everything matters, but at the same time, nothing matters. Like you'll, and this is I think one of those things from a lot of other CRPGs where they'll give you that choice and they'll kind of say, do what you want, but if you don't take this, 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 and this, your whole gameplay's ruined. In Disco Elysium, it's take anything, but if you don't take it, just keep going.
Something is going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's really, I mean, as far as a game that seems at the beginning where you feel lost, man, Disco Elysium, you are just like you're alone in that world and
Mm-hmm.
super confused. And then, maybe by the time you've collected up enough money to pay for whatever chaos you've caused, I feel like it's like getting that big chunk of experience points is like you going like, okay, I think I get it now. I kind of want to do this whole day over again or talk to everyone again
Mm-hmm.
now that I understand what's happening. Um, it's funny. It's like I like to think of the game system as they've written a story out of like 20 channels of audio. But the channels that make noise are highly dependent on the choices you make and your skills.
Yep. And again, like choice wise, I mean, this game just lets you go down the rabbit hole. I think in terms of every possible route that you can think of. Like when you're talking with the manager of the hotel and you're having a whole argument about what's money, and you just have this whole conversation about this doesn't sound right. What's this whole capitalism thing anyway?
Well, and it's a fun way to explore what otherwise kind of people kind of shy away from, these kinds of ideological conversations or politics
Mm-hmm.
and religion, right, at the dinner table.
Mm-hmm.
finds a way to have all those conversations, and I'm sure some people might find it a little heavy-handed in some of
Hmm.
its blatant objectives in terms of like getting you to explore some of the elements of the ideology of how the proletariat should rise up and so forth.
Hmm.
But but at the same time, I feel like more of us should understand what communism is instead of constantly getting in arguments with people, getting into arguments where nobody knows what it is.
Hmm. And the game definitely, I remember a lot of people were talking about kind of like the politics of Disco Elysium, and it is a game that very much, I think, tries to hit a lot of different topics. And part of it, I think, is the fact that your main character, like, this is like one of the few cases where the whole blank slate archetype kind of fits within this space. Because in the first few minutes, you learn that your character got so drunk
Yeah.
that he completely wiped his entire memory. I love the whole kind of explaining that to Ken there about, I remember nothing. It's like, oh, I'm sure you're fine. I'm like, no, I literally remember nothing.
And he's very nice about it.
Hmm. Yeah. Ken is the
Kim is
unsung hero.
yeah, he's totally the unsung hero, and I have a great deal of I have a lot of compassion for him and the effort he makes to tolerate you.
Hmm. I think my favorite like early line in that game was when you're dealing with the races in the world, and like Ken goes, this one is pretty bad, but I'm sure the third races will be even better.
That's awesome, totally.
And the guy goes, and I said, "Wait, what makes you think there's going to be a third racist?" And I just like how he says so nonchalantly, "There's always another racist."
Yeah, and I think like what's interesting too, like I think well, first of all, um, maybe uh, one of our round table topics should be us discussing broaching the topics of ideology in our
Hmm.
entertainment expressions,
Hmm.
and then I'm sure we can use Disco Elysium as one of a number
Yeah.
of examples. Maybe too small a number, really, because it does seem like actually strange enough, maybe unrelated or loosely related to this conversation. I was having a conversation about how our society has gotten so pop culture
Hmm.
that it's almost lost sight of the reality that for the most part art throughout our entire history has been fundamentally ideological in its nature.
Hmm.
And now I think if you're born today you might see the default as the opposite.
Yeah. And yeah, that was one of those very interesting aspects of this Elysium about having these conversations. As you said, like as you were describing, I was going through my own like what was that the term they used, the mind mansion or the mind trunk or whatever it was.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact words. I want to say mind palace, but I'm just thinking
Yeah.
of what was that movie where
Sherlock.
well, Sherlock and but there's a cheesy horror movie where Captain Winters is possessed by an alien, and Marky Mark's brother is possessed by another alien. What am I thinking of? It's out in the snow. It's called Dreamcatcher.
Okay.
Sorry, Dreamcatcher. Super weird movie. Strangely interesting.
Oh, here it is. I looked up the thought cabinet.
Thought Cabinet. There you go. Cool.
So I was going through mine to see what other examples there were of games that try to like really, explore something in terms of either from a political standpoint, ideological, or just even, a serious talk. Like maybe something like Senua's Sacrifice, the whole topic of mental health,
Yeah,
going home.
definitely. Well,
And
I would say all. I mean, it's like the entire chunk of story rich indie games.
mhm,
For them, these topics are just normal
yeah.
and it's straightforward stuff. That's of course they're going to be doing that, right? Um, but outside of that bubble, it's very rare.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point because, like, for myself, I follow a lot of indie developers, and they talk about issues of stuff like everything from representation to again like these serious topics, and like for me, like listening to them talk, like it just sounds like that's the norm. But like you just said, no, it's the opposite. It's very rare outside of these circles to have these conversations.
Yeah, and I mean, I understand why, but I don't think it's the right call. I
Mm-hmm.
think we're over frightened to engage in ideological conversation
Mm-hmm.
because we paint the ideological conversation with the same insanity that we see kind of like, let's say, using American politics as an example. We see that it's become this we're afraid it will be divisive rather than be an exploration. And I think that's a great thing that games can do in a way that a lot of other entertainment has some difficulty, um, in that you can explore the space without taking up a position. And you could
Mm-hmm.
say that not taking up a position is cowardly. And I think as an individual, maybe I'll even loosely agree with that. But when it comes to the importance of exploring the idea, which is vastly more important from like it is more important to me that you explore the idea than you share my idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we have the same thoughts because it's like our commitment to interactivity, our commitment to figuring stuff out, our commitment to like finding new things.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's like totally the bread and butter of like the gamer soul.
Yeah. Here's a bit of a question for you then. One thing, as you were describing that, in terms of presenting something that'll really have an opinion on it, this has been something I think a lot of people had to cry to Ubisoft for, with a lot of their games that either loosely take place in the real world or have real world analogs, such as Far Cry 5. What was it? Watch Dogs. The latest Watch Dogs, I think, is also probably going to run to that as well. And do you think that Disco Elysium falls into that same category, or do you think they kind of avoid those missteps that a lot of people complain about with Ubisoft?
I mean, I think they kind of just push it all the way to the other end of the spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that they are, as far as I can tell, kind of like shameless proponents of exploring
Mm-hmm.
communist ideals.
Yeah.
And I mean, I personally have much less of a problem with that than maybe some would. But I do remember when they had their acceptance speech,
Mm-hmm.
and they talk about Engels and Marx, or didn't they? Maybe they didn't mention Marx, but um, that people responded negatively to that.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I mean, I guess in that moment, I don't know why I thought that was funny at the time, because of course, because ideology, it gets us crazy, right? It gets us inflamed, and it gets us worried. It gets us worried that the world isn't the way we want it to be or something, and it almost for sure ain't the way you want it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, like with something like with what we see from like Ubisoft, they tend to just go, we're going to be trying to use like the latest political trend, but we're not going to say a damn thing about it.
Yeah, they commercialize hardcore.
Yeah.
But that's the thing is that's Ubisoft, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ubisoft is one of the big publishers. They aren't they aren't they aren't a proponent of an ideology, right? They're a
Mm-hmm.
proponent of the users. They and they measure their success by the number of people that like their products. So I don't. There's nothing to blame there. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, if you think that Ubisoft is the place to go to find maybe like a nuanced position on something like that, I think as a consumer, you might be making a mistake. You might just want to grab that game and have some confidence that they've made damn sure that it's as fun as possible
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
with some topical connective tissue, right? They're at least sophisticated enough to try to make it relevant for today or this moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, at a high level, I feel like Ubisoft creative direction is, I mean, without somehow denigrating the other publishers, it's probably more consistently kind of at least hanging out on interesting topics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like with like we're going on a slight like Ubisoft, right? Like their games have, I think, a consistency to them that kind of help them. Like what you're getting into. Like it's
Yeah.
one of the things that we talk about when we say the difference between indie versus AAA. Like Ubisoft's games are very refined. Like, I know I'm not going to be too surprised with whatever game they're playing, but I know I'm going to get a good time with it. Well, with something like Disco Elysium, that again, that was just a complete out left field. You know, here you go. Here's this big ball of crazy. Enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, Disco Elysium has this huge advantage, right, where it's trying to do something that hasn't been done.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way it's pulling its systems together, the stuff that you're getting exposed to, the moment you start figuring out how your stats are really just the way that it the gates that open and close what you see in the
Mm-hmm.
way the story's told, and then suddenly you're kind of like wishing like maybe if I only had a little more volition, and
Mm-hmm.
or it's like so it seems like the encyclopedia is more useful than I thought it was. Like all these things where you wish you
Mm-hmm.
could get more details about the story, and they do a good job with the writing. So you're
Mm-hmm.
left wanting more. It's very well done, and
Yeah.
it was a great like it should be seen as a really great example of how to get our current PC indie audience to go a little crazy real
Yeah.
fast.
And speaking about like your personalities, I think that's another really strong part to talk about. And again, it goes back to the writing of this game. And if I can ever get them on for a podcast, I would just need to ask them like, how long did you spend writing Disco Elysium? Because like for those of you who haven't played it, it is a game that your personalities become essentially like your party members. If we want to use like the direct RPG analog, and they'll chime in as you're having a conversation or you're trying to do something. And like one of my favorites, again, like from the early game, is when you're trying to remember or you're trying to exact details of something. You say, "Sure, my encyclopedia memory knows exactly how this all works," and you fail the roll, and he goes, "What the hell are you talking? I don't even remember your name. What makes you think I know the exact metric system of how of shoe sizes?"
Um, it reminds me there was a TV show a long time ago called Herman's Head. It was like Inside Out, except that it was a TV show about I kind of don't remember, but there was a host of characters that played the various aspects of his personality, and we would flip to inside of his head on a regular basis. Um, there was what was it? There was something. There was a John Cusack movie about
Uh,
a potential serial killer,
hmm.
which has some similar elements to it.
Uh,
Anyways, this kind of this kind of model of inside out like entertainment, I think, is really cool, and um, I think the innovative approach that Disco Elysium took was basically to treat them like they're NPCs
mm-hmm.
that you have a relationship with that are and they just happen to take up the position of ideological kind of standpoints.
Yeah. And on that whole idea of like translating RPG mechanics in a new way with Disco Elysium, another big part that we kind of touched on before this cast is the fact that there's no combat in Disco Elysium. There's very little interaction by the player. Like if we were to put this on the scale or the spectrum of gameplay, we could put like Doom Eternal, Devil May Cry on one side, and Disco Elysium completely on the opposite. And this is one of those things that I think like if you go into this game blind, it's very what's a term I'm thinking of? Very polarizing or very shocking to
Yeah.
play this game and think I'm not really doing anything. Like I'm not really pressing buttons. It's not really the player that's kind of guiding things in that aspect. It's more you're almost like more of a passive observer of these events.
Yeah, you're riding the amnesiac detective.
Or HoboCop if you want to do that.
Hobocop. Hobocop. That's awesome. When it's they keep the entertainment value high, right? With what a massive screw up you are. And then the whole idea of capo types
Mm-hmm.
and well and they do something that we do a lot in Epic Tavern, or there's a phrase that we like to use in Epic Tavern development, which is a game that I work on with my studio, um, where uh, what you want to do is you want to create the illusion that everything is being tracked under the hood and that there are all these deep systems inside of the game that
Mm-hmm.
you don't know about. And the way you do that is you have occasional, extremely specific things that connect to your choices.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the flip side of that is you don't ever have anything in the text come up that is strictly in conflict with what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
So like the right kind of balance of vague and certain types of moments when you can be very specific start turning your brain into believing that now there is like like my mind imagines that there's a machine with like a dial and capo type could be rotating slowly from the sorry capo type to the you know to the analytical capo type or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
you're starting to wonder if uh will uh will having enough in a certain type of having, if you don't have enough conceptualization, is that going to change the ending? Or if I had too much of it, can I short circuit the ending? Right? And you start imagining their system of the way it's like a maze, like or just really just a series of choices for the player. But there's a maze that you can navigate, and you start trying to imagine its shape. And because none of it is conventional, because they took away all the regular gameplay, I mean, except for sort of morale and hit points, kind of like being like magic and, I mean, health and stamina, um, and the fact that you can occasionally create results that seem like combat, it's
Mm-hmm.
all kind of new.
Yeah. And to Thomas's question in chat, unfortunately, neither one of us worked on Disco Elysium. We would like to talk to developers about that, but this is more of us kind of discussing our thoughts and feelings on the design of the game. Yeah, and that whole idea, like, again, like, having your choices matter, but not really. Like, it's just such like a weird turn when, again, like we've spoken before about the Telltale style where they try to make everything important, but in a way it's not. Like your choices don't even really matter short term in a Telltale game. The story has been predefined, and in a way Disco Elysium is that same way. The world is moving on without you. You're not really going to affect things on that front. But like you said, like there are these like pockets of like very hyper focus in terms of how you define your character that come out, and a lot of that again is your whole personality matrix of those various forms there, and it really gives that sense of illusion that yes, everything that I'm doing is affecting the story. Where I'm not sure if it's really that impactful at the design layer.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth noting, right, that very few games offer significant modification to the story. And
Mm-hmm.
those that, as you move towards games that do allow for that, they have significantly less story, right? By having a kind of a, like a, like the very beginning, right? You're playing rogue and you're just running around those mazes with the cursor keys, and you're bumping into bad guys and killing them. That you're kind of creating your own narrative that's unique to you and this particular playthrough, but then nothing about it is specific. And so every single time it's totally unique, and you actually have 100% agency over the true story.
Mm-hmm. Oh, hold on, Tom. One second. My sound went out. Oh, uh, let me see. Are you
Pop,
there?
pop, 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 pop,
There
pop.
you go. For some reason,
Okay.
Discord decided to turn the volume off.
Oh no.
There you go.
So the two sides of it, right, are that on one side, the less story there is, the more the player can actually literally author that story.
Mm-hmm.
So in a game like Rogue, the ASCII game where you're moving around and going through levels of dungeons, you control every aspect of that story that's told. And so every time it's a playthrough, you kind of have 100% agency.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with that is that there isn't enough story there, right, for someone who wants story. And so you
Mm-hmm.
can go on the complete opposite side, where it's like uh, maybe a game like Disco Elysium kind of counts, but maybe the Telltale games are a slightly better example. It's like what's going to happen in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a story you may already know, but you're going to navigate that story, and you're going to be given restricted choices in the flow of going through that story to kind of just customize the noisy aspects of your path, but the path is basically set. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's some amount of blurring of those two lines, right, depending on where the game stands. And I think Disco Elysium, right, obviously for the big beats in terms of like this detective stuff relating to a murder and the relationship between unions and governments and communism and totalitarianism, etc., that
Mm-hmm.
story is fixed. But
Yeah.
there's actually a great deal of it that isn't, right? You like in some ways they tell a story that's like maybe 20 stories worth,
Mm-hmm.
but in your given playthrough, you're only going to expose like 7 of them,
Yeah.
right? And that'll make your telling of that story fairly unique.
Yeah. And I guess here's another like very interesting part about Disco Elysium. When we compare to other games that kind of allow player choice or player customization. Like we've seen this, like going back to like Telltale, or kind of that era when everyone was doing, the morality sliders in games. That for those kinds of titles, it always felt like you really could only play it one way, and that was your specific path. Like, I have never felt the desire to replay a Telltale game because it just felt like I've seen the story. Like, I've seen my version of the story. I'm done, or I'm happy with that. But with something like Disco Elysium, and as you said, it's a game where there could be 30, 40 different kind of story beats or ways things would go. You may only see a handful of them on that specific play. And
When
yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it kind of gives you that incentive to kind of like just like mess around story wise in this world.
Yeah. And there's some like really interesting jovial approaches to stuff that they were able to take, right? And I know this feeling from Epic Tavern is just kind of like a framework for writing in some ways, but
Mm-hmm.
so we're used to the flexibility you get when you can just write whatever, which
Mm-hmm.
means the words can get crazier. There's nothing stopping the words from being crazier, and it's a very liberating kind of
Mm-hmm.
situation to be in. And clearly, in the case of Disco Elysium, they took advantage of that freedom,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes you get on a tirade, right? That would go on really
Yeah,
kind of long.
yeah, like the whole capitalism argument, or like, and it's
Nice,
like one of
totally.
those cases that again, like for somebody like me playing this game, I thought, if I just go down each dialogue option, it'll just be, one additional line. That's it. We're not going to see too crazy. But no, that game's just like if you want to,
Suddenly, it's a novel.
yeah, if you want to explore the pitfalls of capitalism for the next 10 minutes, we're going to rant about that for the next 10 minutes.
And what's fascinating about that is I never really thought about it, but what if the future of interactive textbooks is like, so we're going to give you the surface, and that is like a dialogue option, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I'm done talking about this, and that's it. I got the surface, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
good. And you're like, okay, I'd like to know a little bit more, right? And then that rather than explaining it the best you can in a static description, that it's like a conversation with
Mm-hmm.
a crazy facet of your psyche to learn about these ideologies. Although in the case of Disco Elysium, I do think they're ideological words. They took a lot of care, and it was a
Mm-hmm.
really important part of their
Yeah.
agenda in terms of the message of their art. The crazy stuff it was kind of like, oh man, I can't remember it. There's a very strange tirade, but maybe kind of along the lines of when you accepted I accepted the love quest for the person that I talked to on the phone and the person at the front desk of the motel or
Mm-hmm.
hotel.
Yeah.
And it was awful. The words are awful. It's awful so much of what you do in the game is awful, and so
Mm-hmm.
many of the people are awful. and and it's even better too by putting you on the hook. because you've already done awful things, right?
Yeah.
You have to face them. It's good stuff.
Yeah. And again, like with Ken just like being there as your moral support slash, I'm stuck with you, so I just gotta put up with your craziness. Is just great. I think one of my favorite parts was and again, like the game is such really great in terms of characterization, in terms of like the
Yeah.
various people you meet, like the old woman in the motel, and you're like, you know what, we're going to have you come with us, and Ken's like, what? Yeah, come on, wheelchair detective, let's do this.
Oh man. Yeah. Or it's like I think she even says, right? It's like I'm too old and too married for you. That's what she says, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, it's excellent in terms of like the wide range of characterization of the characters. Um, Everyone sticking to their moral, kind of like to their agenda and whatever their
Mm-hmm.
positions are, and not very little of the experience seems to be there for the convenience of moving the plot forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, y- Disco Elysium deserves to be judged the way you might judge a book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we just said there's a really good point about not moving the plot forward. Like when I played it, like for like a 2 or 3 hours, like the one night, I was like, okay, there's a murder mystery. Hey, what's that over there? And I just like wandered off and just started like talking to people. You get in the middle of the whole strike issue, and I think the game does a really good job of I think avoiding like another thing that we see from a lot of like RPGs and story driven games is the good guys are good, the bad guys are bad. That's it. And as you said, like everyone, I think with like rare exception, maybe like Ken, is generally like bad or they're not exactly like the best people. And the game I think avoids that trap of saying you can do anything that you want because you're the good guy. No, you're just a jerk who drank too much, and now you're trying to figure out what the hell is going on.
Yeah. I mean, well, I have a feeling that you are a broken person of
Mm-hmm.
some hopeful ideology ultimately, right? Because that would
Mm-hmm.
be the right kind of framework for a person to find the light of communism, which at least partly seems to be one of the paths that they want to have exist there.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think my personal take on communism is that it's an experiment that didn't quite work.
And it's also my train of thought there. Yeah, and like again, like I just love like all like the weird conversations that come up because of the fact that you're just trying to make sense out of what's happening. What was I'm trying to think of an example, or like the whole thing, like the thing that came out of it was like maybe I'm a raging feminist, and like your brain's like, are you a raging feminist? Like I don't know, maybe I am, and then, like the guy's like, are you a feminist? Maybe, and like we just all of a sudden we go down that rabbit hole right there.
Totally, totally. Well, and what's funny is like I think when I was younger, I didn't really recognize that people occupied ideological positions even. And we
Mm-hmm.
all do, of course.
Yeah.
It's obvious. It's like there are things that'll upset us and things that we agree with. And oftentimes we ourselves don't even know what those things are. But when I was younger, I swear it's like I didn't know that I was just blind to all of it. I'm like,
Yep.
I don't know. I don't have a good example necessarily, but so walking through this game gives you this fun little opportunity. If I was like a teenager, to like at least have some of those emotional responses to a whole host of mildly ideological interactions with characters. In some ways, I imagine if you played it a bunch, you could get an idea of what you don't like, even
Mm-hmm.
though you hadn't thought about it. And I think
Yep.
that's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah. And to Thomas's question about procedural generated stories and games, that is definitely a very fascinating concept. I think it's one thing that we really don't see explored too much in the AAA space. As we said, they're more concerned about the refinement and kind of commercializing these topics. But again, indie developers at Tomo with Epic Tavern, Dwarf Fortress, Disco Elysium, and so on, there's definitely that space to, let the player kind of be like the architect of the story. And it is, like I think Brian said earlier, yeah, like multi-pass stories are both delightful and exasperating to write. Like it is very hard to do this idea. And like we've said before, the more control you give to the player of how the game plays out, the more nightmarish it becomes to kind of design and create a balanced experience.
Yeah, I think it, I mean, okay, so this is obviously going to come from a pretty specific point of view because if you guys know anything about Epic Tavern, it's
Mm-hmm.
just this immensely complicated exploration or study of procedural storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not purely procedural storytelling. It is an exploration in how to combine procedural and custom. But
Mm-hmm.
in so many ways, I can see like the totality of interactive entertainment as kind of on this spectrum between totally static story
Mm-hmm.
and totally procedural. And something like Dwarf Fortress is going to be way more on this procedural side. But it is true, the majority of the experiences created out there are much more on the already established story that cannot be changed. Um, and uh, I think the reason why that makes sense is because it is hard, right? And also that I think the creative perspective feels a responsibility to its users to deliver the good story,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's kind of outside of that. Yeah, and I'm going to call it yesterday's way of thinking, but I don't mean it isn't today's way of thinking. But to break out of that yesterday's way of thinking is to say that I do trust the player to make that story for themselves. In fact, I found growing up playing games that didn't have a lot of stories sometimes, or had stories that
Mm-hmm.
were totally buried by not enough graphics and not enough sound and not enough whatever, that I was the one in my brain, at least, that I was creating that story. And I found that to be so meaningful. And I'm sure the Dwarf Fortress developers think this, that I'm going to commit all of my life energy to making it so that players can do that for themselves. And that is definitely what we're doing for Epic Tavern as well.
And
Uh,
yeah.
I have something to say here to Matthew Creek, and I don't mean it as too much of a challenge. I don't want preaching in games is pretty preachy. It's that uh, a battle of ideological position of some sort is always happening in one way, shape, or form. And I'm not even trying to necessarily take a side on that. I mean, I think I'm a little bit on the kind of parent that lets their kids, you know, read or watch anything, provided you're there with them to talk about it. In that exposure, I don't think trains us to be the things we're exposed to. I think exposure gives us perspective, right? And I think more stuff talking about more things is broadly beneficial. Um, at the same time, I totally appreciate if someone tries to tell me what to do, my response is generally pretty negative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, hell no, I ain't gonna do what you tell me to do. In fact, I like that song. And so, but maybe a better way of I don't think the people who are preachy are trying to be preachy. They're trying to get a message across, and it's hard to
Mm-hmm.
say something and describe it without sounding like you're trying to tell someone to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an art to that, and
Yeah.
and that as we continue to work, if we got our heads screwed on straight, that we're striving to get better and better at describing the things so that it becomes a space to be for that thing to be discovered,
Mm-hmm.
um, rather than force fed,
Yeah.
like you're like at a seminar for psychology 101 or something.
Yeah, and I think that and Thomas's comment, I think, are a really good point of conversation as well about being able to explore space without, either being preachy or in a way not glorifying the nastier parts of this. And like Thomas' example about, the kids at the hang by, like that's a really good point about, these kids are just, horrible to talk to. They are a nightmare to deal with. And I think there is an art to I'm not sure this is the right term, like almost like a bad or a good bad character, somebody who is horrible, but it's not. It makes you interested in it as opposed to just like turning you off from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because that's the thing too, right? Is it's something I've said I think on one of these streams before is that if the education system didn't leave fun on the table, I wouldn't have a job.
Mm-hmm.
And some mistake happened, and I mean I don't think it's all that weird. It seems we grew up with this idea that fun is bad,
Mm-hmm.
and the educators, the teachers, the university professors out there, right? They think fun is bad too, because otherwise they wouldn't be so unfun. And it turns out making a space for others to explore and draw lessons from, it's just a whole lot better than telling them like, memorize the words to this description
Mm-hmm.
of some ideology. And to be fair, I mean to be absolutely clear, some of the tactics used in the Disco Elysium totally conform to being preachy. And
Mm-hmm.
when I see that, I don't see a ideological problem. I see a well, we didn't have enough time to wrap this message appropriately for the best interactivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yeah, fun is definitely bad. I think we're done here, people. We have to leave.
Well,
And
and thank goodness though, because if education kept the fun, imagine if education and teachers and everyone, they were the keepers of fun and interesting and mysterious and seductive and wanted to draw you into that story, that they were the storytellers. The nice thing about that is we'd all be way more educated, first of all. But then this entire category of capitalism and art, I don't think it would exist. And for all of its ickiness, because hedonism, capitalism, art, all maxed pushed in together into this giant party, has a little bit of collateral damage. It's pretty epically fun. Racist coffee mug, I love that stuff, by the way. It actually had some pretty legitimate use.
yeah, I guess like that's actually a really good. That's actually a really good topic I want to touch on. Also, time wise, we are about 50 minutes in, so I think like another 10-15 minutes should be good.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I
Okay.
totally lost track. I'm glad we set those times before, because otherwise I just like it would be too late and then I'd get all panicky. I'm like, oh, I got to get off the call now.
Yeah. Again, the chat doesn't mind. They want you to sit here for 4 to 5 hours and talk. That's their bread and butter. Um, One thing I want to like, there is like we've been talking about how the game doesn't really have too much in terms of game mechanics, but one area where there is kind of like the mechanic, or at least some more of the player choice, is the clothing and the outfits and the items that you can use. And I thought this was, I don't know, like if it worked as well as I thought it would in terms of you can collect clothing and it gives you +1 to this but -1 to that. Now, to be fair though, I only played the game for like 3-4 hours, and a lot of those just me just messing around. So I don't know how much those items really impact things later on in the game.
Um, so what I got to say is, I think it is one of the more gamier elements of the game.
Hmm.
Um, I think I think that there is a great deal of mechanics.
Hmm.
Um, Especially, well, the more you play, the more its system kind of comes into focus. And the more that system comes into focus, the more you know for sure what you're going to level up the next time you level up. And
Hmm.
often it'll be something that you want to go back to get a roll on again, because you got to pump a skill point into something you failed in order to go back and try it. And they did a decent job of littering the early experience with a couple of places where it's really hard to get the roll right.
Hmm.
And so you'll like kind of chase it over time, and the clothes give you that kind of like granular bit of way to kind of up your odds to making that roll happen. So what's some I can there's like like you get those the rubber gloves that give you +1 to the physical
Hmm.
manipulating of things, and then later on you get one about the what do they call? They call like like body mechanics, like or body function, like electro something.
Yeah,
Um, but then you'd
electrolysis maybe.
switch between those, right?
Hmm.
When you know that there's something you'd have to roll against, and you'd get to the roll, and you'd be like, "Oh, I have an item," and then you back out, and then you'd put on the item, and then you try again to kind of up your odds because you wouldn't want to do the roll because you know it gets locked if you fail.
Oh
It's
yes.
pretty gamey, but at least it's conducive to the players spending more thought energy around the decisions they're making, right? And their memory of what they have available in terms of their powers.
Hmm.
You know, one way I like to distill games in general is for players need to be able to ask themselves, what are my capabilities in the rules of this game? And the more they could the more like that 9-year-old kid could sit down with you and talk and talk and talk about the rules of the game and what choices they would make, the more gameplay space you've created in your systems.
Hmm.
And so I think to that effect, for that's the way Disco Elysium creates its gameplay, or that is its gameplay, I guess.
Yeah. Speaking about gameplay, here's a question for you and for the chat people watching this recorded. In terms of like how you built your character or how you define your detective, did you play the game kind of going for jack of all trades route, or did you go for kind of I'm going to go all in on this and maybe this other personality?
So I went pretty hardcore into the intellect side of things. I think I started with what was it? Not conceptualization. Maybe it was conceptualization was the highest one. I had visual calculus. So I like saw visual calculus and I'm like, "Oh, that's obviously going to be important for a detective. Okay, well, I'll focus on that." And it's like, "Oh," and then that started a process of imagining my character as being a smart detective, which kind of fit in once I figured out what my history was. So, but the thing is, anything I choose could have fit into that history, which is what's great about the history that they establish for you. And then I just ran with it. So then I was more focused on logic and rhetoric. In fact, well, one way of thinking about it is that I went way more down rhetoric than down suggestion. So I wasn't as charming, and I had problems with morale. I didn't have great volition, um, and then my physicality was in the dumps, and so like it took me forever to investigate that body. I had to pull out
Oh
every stop
yes.
to get to being able to do that body thing.
Um,
Um, go ahead, go ahead.
I was gonna say I just remember when you have to the curio shop with like the locked doors, like you can just run your shoulder into it. Like, can I do that? Yeah, go for it. Like, boom. It's like, why did you do that?
I
And
know
Ken's just standing there going, "Are you okay?"
you don't look so good. Well, what's funny is like I was saying in chat how I died when I tried to punch that stupid kid throwing rocks. His name's Kuno or something.
Yeah.
Man, kid was driving me nuts. And it's it's perfectly timed where it's like he's just talking crap to you the whole time, right? And then eventually and then it triggers into him like you're trying to rape me, and then you not like my brain lost it against that kid, but I had kicked something earlier in the game and I had such low endurance, I only had the 2 hit points. So I had kicked something and was down to 1 hit point, and then I tried to punch the kid, and of course I fail because all my physical is super low, and I fall to the ground and I get a heart attack, and then I die.
Yeah.
And that's how I first ended the game, and I was like, "Holy moly, I love this game."
Hmm. The very first time I played, I think I died trying to get the tie off the fan at like the very beginning of the game. Just reach up and grab it. What could go wrong? Oh.
Oh, right. That's how I took the first point of damage because the
Hmm.
kick was at some furnace or something, and that's how I took that point of damage.
Hmm. Oh yeah, and like Crusader Kings is another like very interesting example of just like that kind of. I think that if I were to like compare like Crusader Kings to Disco Elysium, I would say it's like the flip side of the coin almost. That it is the story generating game, but so much mechanically driven. While Disco Elysium is story driven, but again, there's not as much. There's not. it's more storytelling than mechanically driven.
Well, it depends on your definition of mechanics, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, because I would actually describe their system of the physicality, intellect, psyche, and then some other physical thing. I gotta look it up real quick.
Mm-hmm.
It's called. Okay, they have two intellect and two physical. So physique, motorics,
Okay.
psyche, and intellect. And so between that system of those four categories and their constituent 3 to 5 skills or whatever they have, um, there's a lot of mechanics there because it has such a huge effect on the way you might want to approach things, right? So it's all dialogue mechanics, or it's all interacting with object mechanics, right? It's none of it is real time, first of all, right? And none of it is skill or timing based.
Mm-hmm.
Um, unless you want to protect your frustration by clicking on coins on the ground and not missing them.
Now, I guess to begin to wrap things up or to wind things down, if anyone has any like final questions or final thoughts for us to kind of explore, let us know in the comments. One thing that I wanted to ask about, well, my voice is dying. Oh, there we go. One thing that I wanted to ask about, as you were saying earlier, with going all out to try to beat up the kid having it fail on you, and one thing I was just thinking about is this idea of how of taking away control versus giving the player full control. As we said, Disco Elysium is an example where you are given control kind of where it matters. And one thing that I thought about was if the personalities had more control over you. Like if you went too far down one route, the game just basically says, "No, you have to do it this way. I'm not going to let you do anything otherwise." I thought, like,
Love
how much
that
of a
idea.
difference would that have made?
Yeah, if you don't succeed your roll against oh god, I gotta look it up again. The what is it? The
Yeah, it's like,
authority or
yeah.
esprit de corps, right? Because esprit de corps is the copiness of you, and authority is kind of like
Mm-hmm.
government stuff. If you fail the role, you have to go that path, right? If that
Mm-hmm.
was the case, in
Yeah.
some ways, or they like rig it up some way so that your choices, like that, when there's like a conventional appeal to authority in the conversation, that if you don't have enough of that skill, that you don't get to choose. It's like, well, this is the kind of situation where you're going to listen to the police, unless you have, maybe the opposite would be better. It's like you're enough of a rebel that you can say to hell with the what the
Mm-hmm.
government wants me to do. And I'm sure you could take that a million different ways. Actually, it'd be kind of neat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you'd pick your skills and grow your skills based on the kinds of choices you'd want to have more control over. Like, you're like, I want to be able to say no to that every time, so I'm always going to have
Mm-hmm.
more self control,
Yeah.
or and then if you pick hedonism, what's the opposite? It's like, um, you know what? Honestly, it's such an interesting idea. I'd have to sit down and think about it.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, and now I kind of have to build the graph because I think that there's a lot of merit in that little idea.
Yeah, like one of them, like an idea that I came up with for a game a long time ago. It's almost like a Doctor Jekyll and Mister Hyde kind of design, and like the Mister Hyde voice would tell you to do something. You embrace that too much, it would kind of just like take control of your choices. Like it's like, do you want to kill this person? If you say no, but you've gone too far down that route, Mister Hyde would just say, "Yes, you're doing this. You're not in control anymore." Almost kind of like the genocide ending for Undertale, like that final twist. If you try to rebuke the evil voice.
Uh huh. Crazy. Um. Yeah. This is a topic that we could talk about more for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one of these podcasts. Actually, I should you should, if you would let me talk about the underlying structure of Epic Tavern. I could try to
Mm-hmm.
draw in a lot of other games and their storytelling mechanisms, because that's kind of what it's there for. It's
Mm-hmm.
really our It's our dissertation on disassembling storytelling and interactivity. I mean,
Definitely.
this game for the team at Hyperkinetic, when it came out and we got kind of a scent of what it was about, we got the game for everybody and said, this is essential research. You got to understand how this game is trying to do some of the things we're
Hmm.
trying to do. You got to understand it. And it's I think the only game that really was that. I
Yeah.
mean, we've all played like the Telltale games. We know story in games. Everyone's played What Remains of Edith Finch and Gone Home, of course, and stuff like that. But this one was like, in terms of its systematizing and the some of the essence of storytelling and its kind of emotional character, personality related stuff was very interesting.
Hmm. Saying in the
That's funny,
chat.
Thomas. Yeah, I was clicking healing and increasing morale stuff like constantly during that conversation. Panicking because it's like, well, I don't want to give stuff away. It's a solid game. I mean, if
Hmm.
if you like story and game, I don't think you can pass it up, honestly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with that, I guess any final thoughts from you on this Elysium to wrap for your side to wrap the cast up on?
So I'd just like to repeat kind of like my larger structural description of the game. Imagine that you wrote a story out of like 20 threads. And each of those threads was going to be like an audio file that describes the story from a particular point of view. And now pretend that in the game you get to choose through your actions which of those audio channels are making noise. And I think that's what Disco Elysium ultimately is. And so you could theoretically create it if you didn't know anything about its mechanisms, just created your own mechanisms. Is that I wrote one story and then I wrote the same story 20 different ways from very clear perspectives, and then I just turned them all on, and then I chose which ones to turn off, and then the configurations of one like that. Every cluster of 4 of those threads that felt good, I tried to make a target in the choices that the player made.
All right, and for myself, like Disco Elysium is not like one of my go-to games. Again, I'm more mechanically, more gameplay driven. But with that said, this is one of those games I think, as I said earlier, you can tell developers wanted to make this game. Like this was a passion project times a million for them. And if it clicks with you, this is probably going to be like the premier example of like storytelling in games probably for a very long time in terms of this like rabbit hole, like as Tomo said, like it's a story that's broken down to multiple different threads that are then all discombobulated and then reattached based on your own whim.
Oh, and something to add, by the way, we spent the whole stream not talking about how beautiful the game is.
Oh yes.
The art is very good.
Mm-hmm. That I love that hand drawn. It was like a painting kind of effect that they had with it. All right.
And by the way, another tidbit to kind of close the stream. We stream development for our game Epic Tavern 3 times a week, and you can find the schedule at our Discord channel, discord.gg/Epic Tavern.
And I will put a link to the game in chat. There we go. If you want to check it out there.
Awesome.
But I think with that, we will wrap up this month's chat. For those of you new watching, Tom and I do these design casts once a month, and we pick a different game for it. So right now, I think we're leaning maybe towards Spelunky or Spelunky 2 for next month. We'll have to see if anything kind of strikes our fancy. If you want to follow me again, I'm on Twitter at GWBlaster. There are links to my Discord and Patreon link down below. And I will grab Tomo's invite or the Epic Tavern one in the recorded version of this. But if there's any other place you'd like to mention, Tomo, feel free.
We got our Discord channel, our Twitch TV/Epic Tavern Twitch stream, and at Epic Tavern Game, I think, on Twitter. And our you can find us on Steam as Epic Tavern. By the way, this was a great conversation, Josh, and happy to be here as always. It's good times.
Yeah, it's always great to have you on. And yeah, and for those of you who missed it, we of course did our roundtable earlier this week. That should be going up soon, as well as the recording of this one. It's always great to hang out with you, and again, best of luck with Epic Tavern.
All right, for sure. And one of these days you got to jump me in on a conversation with you and Sharky, because those are always fun too.
All right, if you won't come on for a Sunday show, let me know.
For sure, I'll let you know.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me, by the way.
No
Talk to you all
problem.
later.
All right. Well, with that said, everyone, we're going to wrap up this video or this stream here. Thank you so much for watching this live or recorded. I will be back, of course, for our nightly streams. Be sure to check out Epic Tavern at the links down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where he's in the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.